Welcome to Desk Careers. My name is Miss B, and I am so excited to be bringing our next guest. Today, we are speaking with Nick Phipps, who is currently a games designer working with Ubisoft here in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Welcome, Nick. I'm so excited to meet with you today.
Hi, great to see you. See everyone as well.
It's so exciting. In the audience right now, we have our live students in the media department listening into this conversation, and I know they have so many questions. So we'll quickly go through the ones that I've prepared and have this incredibly interesting conversation with you, and then we will be opening it up to our live audience in the Q&A. I think before I get into any of the fine details of what you're doing currently, I'd like to take you down memory lane. I know we had a conversation offline, and we talked about the interview and you told me a little bit about yourself. And I left that conversation feeling really inspired. And by inspired, I don't mean I wanted to go out and become a games designer. I mean, as a practitioner of careers, what really, really inspired me was the journey that you took to that found you where you are today. So I'd like to take you down that memory lane for us again. And where did it all begin for you, Nick? Did you know that this was what you wanted to do when you were a younger teenager?
I'm not too sure. So when I was a teenager, yes, I loved games. I loved making games, but I never really saw it as a career at the time. It was just a thing I enjoyed doing. But at the same time, my father was also a computer programmer working from home. So I had a lot of exposure to app development and that sort of thing from that side of it. So I would sit and talk with him through his problems and all of the fun stuff that goes along with programming. But yeah, when I was a teenager, I didn't particularly know that I wanted to be a game designer, but I did enjoy doing it at the time.
Which is very similar to lots of young teenagers today. They enjoy the games, but in a past conversation I had with probably a colleague of yours from your past, he was telling me that when he was younger, he loved playing with the games, but the idea of where these games came from was beyond him. And would you say that was a similar experience for you, that you enjoyed playing the games, but this idea of there's an actual job that somebody has to do this? Was that something that you ever thought about?
No, so I would be the complete opposite. When I would play games, I would play them trying to figure out how to break them and how they were made. So and even now, I still don't play games as just enjoying the games. I play games trying to figure out why people put something in a specific place and what that actually means to the gameplay and how it can break if I go and dig at the wrong corner and go through the wall.
Amazing. So let's talk about your academic journey. I know that you took a path that was very different to many young people. And I know that sitting in front of this interview right now are a group of young people that are right at the top of their secondary education in those years, very close to graduation. And one of the biggest concerns they have, or that they might be having, is making the choice that feels right for them academically. Take us on the academic journey for yourself, Nick. What was that like for you in terms of what you thought you would be doing and what you're currently doing?
So for me, that is very different from every one of your students there, because for me, I dropped out of school before I got to high school. In the last year of primary school, I left school and I pretty much started working full-time from that point when I was about 13, 14. And I then did many jobs doing various things. One of which, I grew up on a farm, so I grew up working just at home was work. I was a sign writer, I was a fish and chip cook, I managed a warehouse, I was a sound technician for media crew. I did all sorts of things for those years. And then after that, after working for about 9 years doing all sorts of different jobs, I then went and started a university degree to study game design. So I went and did all sorts of things, tried different things, and then when I had sort of come to a point where I figured this is what I actually want to do, then I went to university and studied to do game design.
I find that really incredible because on the one hand, many young people think they have to get it right at 16 or 17 or 18. And if they don't get it right, they're afraid that the future is going to be so unprecedented that, you know, they don't know how they'll make it through. Was that a thought for you at that time, or were you just kind of on the journey of living and doing those different things? Did anyone ever say, you know what, Nick, you have to do the traditional academic pathway that everybody else is doing? Or were you kind of like, whatever, this is what I want to be doing and I'll find my way through?
So I never had those people who were saying you have to go and do this, you have to go to uni, you have to do the traditional sort of things. So I am one of 6 kids. So I had my oldest brother was the complete opposite. He was dux of his year 12 class and went on to go to university for law and is now a lawyer. And my younger brother was more like me and dropped out of every school that he went to, and within the time that I was at school he went through pretty much every school in the region and then went and joined the military afterwards. So I've seen both sides. I never had anyone particularly pushing me in either direction. So yeah, it wasn't that I had a real push either way. It was that at the time I was enjoying what I was doing and I didn't particularly see any purpose in the schooling that I was doing because that didn't appear to be relevant to the sort of things I was doing at the time. So yeah, it wasn't like I have to do school to get a job. I was already working in a job making money, so it was never even a thought in my mind that school is required to work and be professional.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is you were really intentional about the education that you were going to embark on, which is how you described understanding that this was what you wanted to do, and you then went back to university. And I know that you started in Brisbane at Quantum College, where you did a bachelor's of interactive entertainment and game design. But then you went on to Twofour54 in the Gaming Academy and did game and interactive media design. Why did you do 2 degrees back to back? Was there a reason for that, or was it just because you were really enjoying that learning journey and wanted to do more?
Yes, so that change was very specific for me. So I was studying game design in Brisbane, and at the time there wasn't very many options for jobs in Brisbane. That year, sort of the last major gaming studio in Brisbane was closing down, so there was only pretty much one option in Brisbane. So when one of my lecturers mentioned that he was writing the curriculum for the Twofour54 Academy, I applied to come here because it had a relationship with Ubisoft and the studio here. So that move was, I restarted pretty much the same degree under a different university because they had a connection with a company that I wanted to get a job with. So that move was very intentional to have better options at getting a job straight out of uni.
And it worked. You've been at Ubisoft Abu Dhabi for a little over 8 years. And your projects are absolutely incredible. Some of the ones that I know about are Growtopia, NCIS Hidden Crimes, and CSI Hidden Crimes. Let's talk about this experience, because I know that students are really interested in this idea of game design and what they really need to do to prepare themselves for it. So if you can, compare what it's like to learn about game development and game design at university, and then what it translates into as somebody actually doing it as a career.
Okay, so when you're learning about games, you're learning all of the different aspects that you would potentially need to make a game. And when you get into a job, depending on how big the company you're working for, you may end up only doing just one of those things. Or if you end up being in a very small company or a very small project, you may end up using every single one of those skills on a regular basis. So it varies quite significantly, both depending on the project and depending on the company that you're working for. So for an example, the CSI and NCIS games were very big projects with 50 odd people working on them. And in my design team, there was 6 or 7 designers. So I did a very specific thing in many of those games, or many of the projects, like the release updates that we did for those. Whereas when I started on Growtopia, I was the only designer and I had 2 programmers with me, and that was the entire team. So I did everything. I did art, I did programming, I did design, I did testing. I was literally doing everything that there is to do on the project. So yeah, it does vary quite significantly. The other big thing that you will have is you will have spare time while you're studying to be able to play games and figure out and study other games, which once you start working, finding that time to go and study games and see what other people are doing in the field is quite difficult.
Absolutely incredible. What would you say it has been the game that you've been the most proud of, something that you've created?
All of them. I know it's a silly question. No, well, the most recent one would have to be my most proud one. But all of my projects, I am incredibly proud of what we achieved with them and what they did. But Growtopia is an amazing project and always evolving. So every single release, I am incredibly proud of what we can achieve and how the next one we can improve and do better every time.
I want to take you through the systems that you would be using. And students are really curious about the types of systems that game developers and game designers use to create the game concepts and, of course, the story characters. Can you take us through the types of systems that you would be using?
Okay, well, I'm going to burst everybody's bubble and tell you this is my system. The most useful tool you have is your notebook. One of the most used and useful tools, and you will use it for almost everything you do. When you're in a meeting, taking notes, when you're trying to explain an idea to somebody, scribbling the idea, and just for all of those guys who aren't terribly good artists, you don't have to be a good artist. Let me show you some of my scribble. This is what it looks like to scribble, to try and explain an idea. You're literally just scribbling rubbish so that someone can understand roughly what you're thinking, because you're explaining something and then you draw how that actually shows out. But then on top of that, I use Excel quite extensively for everything. So both design and balancing and numbers and planning, all of that, I do a lot of work in Excel, and almost exclusively CSI and Hidden Crimes, both the Hidden Crimes games were almost exclusively made in Excel. So when you're thinking about the game tools, I want to really emphasize, please, please, please don't go and start fights about what's the best tools and what's the best engines to be using, because it's essentially irrelevant. Every studio will have a different set of tools that you're going to use, and every project as well is going to have a different set of tools. So don't get sort of bogged down on what tool is the best. More learn how to use the tools you have to do the best with what you've got.
What about, I know that young people will be thinking, yeah, but Nick, how do I prepare for a job interview? Like, what if they ask me about systems? What should I tell them? So if there was one that you think, other than your notepad and Excel, if there was one that you think, you know what, if you're going to learn a system, this is a really good one, and it will be recognized in any kind of interview where you're being interviewed for game design or game development.
I would say, once again, it is not relevant which one you're good at. Whichever one you're learning, you should be able to show that you're competent in that one. But when it comes to game design, probably the more interesting things that you will be asked is, do you understand how design and designing a system works? So a fairly common one that you might be asked in an interview would be something like, if I gave you scissors, paper, rock, and I told you to take away one, which one would you take away and why? That's a fairly common question to be asked in a design interview. And what you're actually looking at is, do you understand what each element in this design, because scissors, paper, rock is a very simple design, what each element does and why, and what would be the impact if I take away one of those systems. So in design, it's not so much about the tools that you know how to use. It's about, do you understand what the design is and what it means to the rest of the systems or the project.
You are surprising me here today. I was expecting some really like way out there type of systems, and you're mentioning things that I think most people would have heard of, if not tried out themselves. Nick, a common misconception from educators, adults, young people is that in order to go into a career like yours, you need to take computer science at university. Is that true? I mean, I know that you didn't, but now that you're in the industry, do you look around at other colleagues and think, I should have done that? Or do you think that, as you said, everyone does something very specific? It really doesn't matter that you had that or not going in?
I would say it's not necessary. I would say any field that you study will be useful. Design's one of those fields that's a little bit different to most things, where in design, your experiences are probably your most valuable tool that you've learnt. So what you've learnt at school, whatever that is, if you did art, you will be more effective at communicating to an artist. If you did a computer science studies, you will be more effective at communicating to someone who understands computer programming and that side of the project. So each of those are useful in how they let you understand and communicate with the different fields that require it. I don't think in themselves they are necessarily needed. Once again, the project will change that quite significantly. Some projects may require a designer to do a significant amount of programming, in which case having a solid understanding of programming is useful. So I would say, no, it's not needed, but it is useful. Most of the designers I know come from artistic backgrounds and not a programming background. So in that case, I am sort of the exception, not the rule. I have a more solid understanding of programming, having grown up with my father as a programmer. So many of the things I understand are the programming side, not the artistic side, whereas many of the other designers I've worked with understand the art side more and can scribble a lot better than me and are far more artistic, and they have a better time communicating with artists and can discuss art theory with an artist a lot easier than I may be able to.
So I'm going to ask you something that we didn't really talk about before, and I love surprising my guests with surprise questions. I think it's a really important topic. How does gender play in game design and game development? Is it predominantly a male-dominated industry, or are you starting to see more female designers and developers?
I've worked with many female designers and developers. Personally, I don't see any difference in skill level, but as far as design goes, there is, it's a lot of it is psychological. So understanding the psychology of your player, and in that, I believe that it's very important to have a shared, like a fairly even split of both male and female designers, because they can understand personally. A male designer will never be able to understand personally a female's perspective on a certain thing, whereas a female designer will be able to give a different perspective in that. So I do think it's very important to have both. Personally and historically, there's been a far more male dominated, but I have seen many more female designers and just general in the games fields. More recently, it's becoming more common and more evenly split.
That's so great. I love to hear that. And it brings me to wondering where you get your ideas from. Are these games created out of, ideas that are just kind of whims out of nowhere, or should we start looking at these games and thinking, I wonder what the designer was really thinking about when he or she put this game together? Is there any connection to life experiences when these games are being designed? I know you can only talk from your subjective experience.
Yes. So, firstly, I would say that a game is very, very rarely built on a whim. Almost everything that you see in a game will be intentional in some form, whether that is very loosely intentional or very, very intentionally placed. Most things inside a game will be very intentionally placed. Like, for example, you will have a team of designers and artists and programmers sitting around discussing, why do we put this thing here, and the reason that it's there and what it's actually achieving in being there. So everything that you see, from just a box on the floor to why was this specific wording used, why did we use exit instead of back, those kind of things will all be very, very in-depth discussed as to what should be here and why. So it's very rare that you'll see a game is just made on a whim, but there are some ideas that will come from just a random thing. We had one that was just, one of our programmers was like, hey, why don't we do this thing? And everyone was like, that's a great idea, let's do it. And that was the design process. And then from that, we then went and discussed all the details. But it can come from very loose ideas, and it will then be discussed in detail after that. But as far as where I get my ideas, I would say experience plays a very big role, because you can only start from something that you understand. So the more wide your experiences, your personal experiences are, the better it is. So I can only even think of an idea that I at least know something about. And then from there, I can do more research and find out more. So if I'm designing something on ancient Egypt, I at least need to know where to start looking. So if I have heard something about ancient Egypt, then I can start digging into what different aspects I want to start touching on. So yeah, everything that you can do and experience yourself is the best place to come up with ideas, because from your experiences, then you'll be able to find something interesting in that experience that you had and use that to try and give somebody else a gaming experience inside that field. For example, Pokemon came from a childhood love of catching bugs. And from that childhood experience, you now have the game Pokemon of catching Pokemon. So yeah, go and get experiences.
So that's kind of worrying from a mom's perspective and an educator. I'm looking at some of the work that you did, Hidden Crimes and CSI Hidden Crimes. Like, if we're looking at these games and thinking somebody behind this game, this was a life experience, what should we be thinking about those really violent games, or those games where, it might not be really putting out what adults and parents are hoping their children could be exposed to?
Are you talking about as the player experience or as a designer experience in this
I'm
situation?
talking about as a player experience now, because I think
Okay.
students want to know what's on the other side of that screen, correct? So when you're designing something, I'm assuming that all of you are also thinking, well, what is the game experience that our players are going to have? And, what do we want them to be walking away with? Or is that even part of the equation when you are designing these games?
It is very intentionally part of the design. So for example, for Hidden Crimes, our audience was a 32-year-old woman. So that's the kind of person that you're trying to target your stories towards. It's the same as when you're writing a horror movie. You're not necessarily trying to write to a 12-year-old child. You can't stop a 12-year-old child from playing it, but you can be very intentional about how you write it and who you're writing for. So we do think very much on who is our target audience. And for things like children and stuff, we can prevent them through rating systems. But outside of that, it's mostly up to the parents to be able to monitor and be able to control what they allow their children to play. So from a design perspective, we do try and be as thoughtful in how we use those things, and very intentional that we're not abusing, let's say, children in a way that we're using psychological traps to try and make them pay. That's very frowned upon in the game industry, and things like that.
So being very ethical and being really, really consciously aware of what you're doing. So much thought put into these game designs, so much more than, the general perspective of the work that game designers and game developers do. I know that I've asked so many questions. I have so many more, but I want to give our live audience an opportunity to ask you their own questions. So I'm going to bring our recording to a wrap. Thank you so much, Nick. It was a real pleasure having you here with me today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We were meeting with Nick Phipps today, who is a game designer currently working with Ubisoft in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you at our next Desk Careers Digital Spotlight.